It was one reason why they split up with Martin, because Martin wanted to, and the funny thing was he was absolutely 100% right. He wanted to buy a Fairlight because it'd just come out, and he thought that Fairlights and this electronic music thing was going to be the thing. And it was quite expensive at the time. It was like 15 grand or something. And he said, we should get this. It's going to be really big. And they said, well, we want to open a nightclub. And he said, what the bloody hell do you want to open a nightclub for? Are you mad? Get a Fairlight, that's where it's all about. We're supposed to be musical, you know, things like that. So they had a really big row about it. And we ended up going with the nightclub, which was why... There's a lot of other things as well, but that's why they parted. And we started the Hacienda in the same way we started the band. We knew nothing about it, completely naive, stupid almost, and made loads of mistakes. And unfortunately, when you get involved in business, it costs a lot of money, and the mistakes have been very, very expensive.
Wilson could be incredibly stubborn, and he refused to acknowledge the potential disaster that the Hacienda was becoming. He wasn't in it, he said, to make profit. He was doing this for the city, for its future, and he faced up to the financial loss as if he knew that eventually this absurd venture would turn into the famous cultural landmark he always intended it to be.
The reason that Factory and New Order built the Hacienda was to put some of the royalties from Closer and Still and Love Will Tear Us Apart back into some of the people who'd earned those royalties. The vibrant Manchester community that had first gathered at the Lesser Free Trade Hall for the Pistols on June 20th, 76, and had been there through Rafters and the Factory and the Electric Circus. And that community that they remained a part of, and by being a part of that, by being ordinary people, they remain a part of the community and allow themselves to grow.
Paul Ryder.
I used to go most nights when it was open from 82 onwards. They used to send out newsletters at that time, 82 and 83. I used to go watching bands there, and the guy that was booking the bands had a great knack of booking them just before they exploded and went massive, and that guy was Mike Pickering. You know, so he knew his music, and he was getting some really good bands on at the Assay. And it was great, because if there was 40 people, and that meant it was full, you know what I mean? It was like you just had lots of room to watch great bands.
Mark Radcliffe.
Well, the Hacienda is this now this fantastic legendary club, which was full of nightlife, and you know that everybody remembers as great times and everything. And that made my memories are sort of slightly different. It was this kind of really brutal industrial space, which looked fantastic in all the photos. Look, but if you're going there for a night out and everything was echoing around this barn with no one in it, I mean, it was just awful. It wasn't until all the kind of Manchester and all the rave stuff kicked in that it really became its legendary self. So I remember it as this empty barn with reverberating music and steel plate and thinking, this ain't going to last.
Factory's graphic designer, Peter Saville.
The Hacienda was directly funded as a result of Joy Division sales, as a result of Ian's death. But strangely, it kind of laid the seeds for what would come later, for the Manchester, you know, moment and the Mondays. But for 5 or 6 years, the Hacienda stood relatively, not empty, but quiet, draining money away. But everybody believed in it. They felt it mattered, and they persevered with it. There was no one ever looked at the bottom line and said, this isn't profitable, let's pull the plug on it.
But Wilson's views about the history he was part of tended to change to suit whatever story he wanted to tell. And recently, when asked about his feelings towards the Hacienda, he didn't hold back.
I remember once saying to Bernard Sumner out of New Order at the end of another tortuous, bloody meeting about money and gangs and police and drugs and money. At the end of it, I said, listen, Bernard, I know it's a nightmare, but imagine there was a button and you could press it and the Hacienda would never have existed. Show me the fucking button. That was his response. And that is, I think that's all of our response, actually. I know I rang up my partner, Alan Erasmus, the other day and said, I thought I should ring you. It's Happy 25th. And he just exploded down the phone at me. How fucking dare you? happy birthday to that fucking place. I mean, near the end, Stephen and Gillian of New Order got out. They were told by their accountants and lawyers, you can stay in but never go to meetings again. No, we just want out completely. It had been such a nightmare for so long.
Mark Radcliffe.
I think the sort of thing about Tony and about Factory was that they were kind of willfully obtuse, really, you know. And the sort of example of that comes back to me, I used to do a late night show on Piccadilly Radio on a Friday night called Cures for Insomnia. People would bob in who were around town and doing gigs and things, and people I knew Tony. And he came in one night. I said, have you got anything new? Big suit and, you know, fill the room. Oh, and but, you know, very affectionate and effusive. And he gave me this acetate, a 12-inch single. And he said, we could play this. This is something new from New Order, you know, the first time it's been played. And he said, don't play the A-side, though, you know, like put a B-side on. Put the B-side on. And, of course, the A-side was Blue Monday, which I missed out on being the first person to play that because Tony wanted to play The Beach, which was the instrumental on the other side, you know. And so, you know, having just created what would go on to become the best-selling 12-inch single, Tony breezed in and insisted he played the instrumental on the B-side. And, you know, that was the way they operated. I mean, why do that? But there you go. That was
the diversion of research funds and earned royalties away from producer Martin Hannett because of the construction and running of the Hacienda eventually meant that he would leave Factory and sue them for withheld money. The man who invented the sound of Factory and influenced the sonic adventure of post-punk itself backed away into his own bitter exile. Part of the comedy and tragedy and delight of Factory was that even when they shot sideways into success, they found ever-inventive ways to shoot themselves in the financial foot. Not putting hit singles on their albums was part of the Factory manifesto that seemed ideological and uncompromising. New Order were having magnificent mid-80s hits, but pumping £10,000 a month into the club. They were pop stars, suffering a weird kind of poverty. Hooky from Joy Division and New Order.
We went through a very strange phase then of being very successful and not having two halfpennies to rub together. You know, screaming because you couldn't pay your gas bill or you were about to be cut off. I mean, I was in them days. I was putting a gallon of petrol in my car a week because that was all I could afford. £2. And I had a Mark 10 Jag. I used to do 10. I never used to be able to get to town even. All I had was £2 a week.
Producing a record sleeve that meant you lost money on every copy you sold was Factory's anarcho-capitalist principles left to run amok. New Order were now a regular chart act. 1987's True Faith single and their Substance compilation confirmed their status as pop greats.
FAC 501, the story of Anthony H. Wilson.
But Wilson, having missed, intentionally or not, the Smiths, desperately needed another band that would sell records. And then, as if Wilson knew it all along, as if it was part of the business plan, Factory came across the group that would commercially reflect the sound of the Hacienda and the agitating spirit skittishness of Wilson himself, and give the whole idea of Factory vital cultural impetus. After a couple of false starts, Happy Mondays, Wilson's dream boy band, a hybrid of the hooligan, the poetic and the self-destructive, combined the enthralling electronic body music being imported from Detroit and Chicago and played in the Hacienda with rough, ecstatic northern post-punk. By the end of the 1980s, Wilson started to live the life of successful impresario, enjoying his preposterous adventure in the music business. In some ways, he set up the label simply so he could have wonderful anecdotes to tell about his boys, who he loved as much as they made him despair. Paul Ryder.
Tony came across the Mondays through Rob Gretton and Phil Sachs. Phil Sachs was managing us by that time. Phil Sachs knew Mike Pickering, who, as well as booking the bands, he was also A&R in for Factory. But I think this has been said before, when I was a postman, I actually shoved a demo cassette through Hooky's door. So a year before Tony heard us, Rob had actually heard the Mondays and thought, there's something there, you know. So it was a combination of right people in the right place at the right time.
New Order's Substance led to Joy Division's 1988 Substance compilation, and signs that the myth of Joy Division was growing in strength, just as Wilson had predicted and to an extent engineered. Joy Division's doomy mood classic Atmosphere was re-released as a single with an Anton Corbijn video that unashamedly positioned Ian Curtis as mysterious modern myth. The Hacienda's reputation as the place to be, listen, dance and lose one's mind was attracting fans from all over the country. Ben Kelly's design helped the place seem to be the pleasure centre of the dance universe.
Out of the debates and discussions as to what it might be and what might go where, I had to steer a course through all of that. Had the stage gone at the far end where the bar ended up, it would have primarily been a venue, and the emphasis would have been on a venue space, and anything else would have been secondary to that. Luckily, I believe it went to one side, facing where the balcony went, and that sort of skewed the notion of it specifically being a traditional venue.